Today, we have Tim Finan and Mamadou Baro from the University of Arizona talking about some work that they have done for the Atlas project, which is an aid-funded project implemented by communes, looking at governance and climate adaptation with a particular focus on decentralization. All right, I got that one right. And I also want to say thanks to communes and the Atlas project for hosting us here in their space. And with that, I will turn it over to Tim and Mamadou.
Hear me all right? You can hear, right? Yeah. First of all, I'd like to thank communes and Chris and Doug Baker for the support of this and opportunity to do this kind of a research project. We at the university don't have so many opportunities for this kind of applied research in the aid system. And for us, it's been a true pleasure to try to use our university training and skills and to use it in a way that has some application that might be beneficial. So this has been for us a very pleasant project, and it has gone smoothly. I also want to thank here, actually I wanted to note that Mamadou Baro and I are actually brothers. People don't often recognize it, but we have worked together in West Africa since early 1990s. And I wanted to thank people that I think are listening to us, and that is particularly Nadia Genonten, who was the Venezuela's partner on our team. She wasn't able to travel because she's in class. She's a graduate student at the University of Arizona and was instrumental in the preparation of this research. And we also want to thank Sahel Echo, our partners in Mali, who I believe also might be attending this particular presentation. Particularly the director, Pierre Dembele, and the team that worked with us in the field work team of 12 people, was it? 12 people. So that being said, this is what the central research question was for our project. And it was to understand how decentralized governance can confer an adaptive advantage on local level communities. Can it help build resilience to climate change? And what are the mechanisms by which this governance works? I mean, to say that governance does it is one thing, but to have to show what is the dynamics in the process by which governance can make a difference. This was also a focus of our research. And we also wanted to do it in such a way where the implications would be clear for programming, strategic programming in climate change and for investment. What we're going to show here is I don't have to go through this, but here's the logic of what we're going to be talking about. And let me talk first about the context of Mali. In Mali, the main factors that help understand what we're dealing with when we do this kind of research is the environmental variation. Mali is a very large country through which the Niger River runs. To the north, it is essentially a Saharan environment, desert-like, getting about 200 millimeters of rainfall a year. As you move south, it gradually becomes a Sahelian type environment in which there is an emphasis on rain-fed agriculture, small grain, primarily small grain agriculture. Now, this means also that there is a tremendous amount of ethnic diversity. Towards the north, you have Tuareg and Arab populations. As you move south, you have populations of Bambara and others that are mixed in any given community. You would find a mixture of ethnic groups. The other thing is that there is a tremendous amount of political instability, and during our research it was difficult for us to move anywhere into the northern regions of the country. We had to restrict ourselves to those regions in which we had access. And those regions happen to be the more Sahelian type environments to the south and southwest, which is also the breadbasket of the country and also the area that generates most of its agricultural product. Now, the other thing is that Mali is and has been a leader in this experiment, as it were, this experience of decentralization. In 1993, the Malian government, moving away from a highly centralized type of governance inspired by French colonialism, moved into a system in where power was devolved to local level. And it has been a sort of reference or a frame of reference for many of the other countries in that area in West Africa. Our methodology, is that? Oh, got it. Sorry about that. Okay. Our methodology, for reasons of the nature of the research question and the amount of resources available, was a qualitative survey, a qualitative project, a methodology. And we worked and selected, we sampled 5 communes, which is the lowest elected administrative level in Mali, in 3 regions that are in this south-southwest part of the country. And we did focus group discussions with groups of men and groups of women in individual villages. We worked in 3 villages in each commune. We would visit those villages, organize a focus group discussion with a group of men, organize a group of discussion with a group of women, trying to assure that we had captured vectors of diversification, of variability within these communities. And then we also carried out approximately 6 to 8 individual household interviews in each village. And then we had a number of focus group and key informant interviews that were done at the level of the commune with the people who are the elected bodies, for example, the mayor and the council, and the people that provide all kinds of technical services in the area of agriculture, livestock, forestry, and so forth. And then also we met with teachers, healthcare providers, etc., trying to understand this nature of climate change adaptation in Mali. And in all total, we did 193 interviews. They were recorded as text, and we have over 800 pages of text. We did a content analysis on that, and then we produced the report. The report was then presented in Mali, both to the USAID mission, and was presented at a public workshop that we organized that had some 45 people present from among our stakeholders in country. These are the study sites. How can I point that way and look this way? These are the study sites, and you can see the one that was the diciest is where Commonix has its MCCAA project in Kona, because that's an area in which there's been outbreaks of violence on a fairly regular basis. These are focus group discussions, just photos to prove that we were there. We didn't take these offline on the internet. This was the public presentation that was held, the workshop in October. This was the people that participated in it. And so we, is this another, did I miss another one? One of the ways that we approached this was to understand the nature of the livelihoods in Mali. And what are the factors that sort of determine livelihoods, that characterize livelihoods in country, at least in the area where we were working. One is that these livelihoods are invested in significant crop diversification between food crop and cash crop. In some cases, there are women that are doing small-scale vegetable marketing, vegetable production and marketing, which is a source of income. That is to say that there is also a great deal of income variability, income diversification. We showed that the population, the people in our communities that we studied are engaged in outmigration, either seasonal or temporary or periodic or even long-term outmigration. They engage in things like gold mining, and then there are people that do have bicycle fix-it-up and small business and so forth. So there was a great amount of income diversification in these livelihoods. The level of social capital is really important in these places, in these villages. People are always trying to solve problems together. They collaborate in so many different ways in sharing of the basic factors of production of land, labor, and capital. They also, there is a widespread importance of land and land tenure. This is something we didn't focus on particularly in the study, and if we were to redo it, would have tried to put a better understanding of how people access land and what are the issues in how one group gets land that's better than others, and the sort of stratification of land access. The other thing is that people talked about population pressures. And the population pressure, these communities had grown significantly, and they had done so because of the expansion of agriculture, of farming. And farming, of course, is slash and burn type of clearing. And so this has, as farmland has expanded, it's put pressure onto livelihood activities. So livestock activities. So livestock activities have to readjust to this. There's conflict, and this is fairly well documented. And then the other thing is that people perceive environmental change. They see their surroundings changing, and they change in this way. They have seen changes in the rainy season. The onset, the length, the intraseasonal distribution of specific rainfall, rainfall episodes. Overall, they think that there has been lower precipitation relative to the time of their fathers. They talk about excessive temperatures that were never around before. And then they mention the occurrence and frequency of violent storms and violent events that don't seem to have been that way in the past. Now, these, of course, are all perceptions, and we're not sure to what extent these can be documented on a climate record. We do know that some climate information does indicate that since the 1960s, there's been increased temperature, average temperature, annual temperature, and that there's been of about almost 1 degree centigrade, and there's been a decrease in precipitation. These data are not as robust as we would like it to be. So what do we mean by governance, and how does governance work? In Mali, with the 1992-1993 legislation, they created a basic system, a basic political structure, administrative structure, centered around the commune. The commune is the lowest level of elected administrative and political activity, and it has, any given commune has a sort of larger market village as its center, and then has a number of other villages sprinkled away from the center, maybe to 10, 12, 15, 20 kilometers away. These are much smaller villages, and they tend not to have much of the infrastructure that you would find in the commune seat. Every 5 years, when there's a change in administration in Malian government, hypothetically, there is an election, and in each commune, there is the election of what we call commune council. And the council depends on the size of the commune, but it has upwards of a dozen to 20 members on the council. And it's important to note that not every village has, per force, someone on the council. So that there are some people on the council, there might be some villages with more than one person on the council, and in other villages might not have anyone on the council. The council then elects someone that's called the mayor, and then the deputy mayor. And then there are other administrators that have a specific role with responsibility over revenue, responsibility over different sector type activities. But basically, all of the power is in the hands of the mayor and the mayor's council. What they do is that every change of government, when you have a new government, the council is responsible by law to put together a development plan for 5 years. This is called PDESC, or fondly known as PDSEC. So the PDSEC is the key document, the roadmap that is supposed to guide development in a development village over a 5-year period in each commune. And there are guidelines as to how you. It has to be highly participatory. It has to be highly consultative. You go to the villages, you talk to village chiefs, you bring together priorities and needs, you do a sort of needs assessment, and then you compile all that into a plan for 5 years which says this is what we need to do. We have to open this much more land for women to do their gardening. We have to build these roads. We have to get these roads improved from between this village and that village. We have to build a school. We have to add classrooms. We have to add a health center, things like that. So this is what the plan would look like. Now, we ask ourselves, well, what is the nature of adaptation to climate change in Mali? And how does governance fit into this? And from the interviews, it sort of emerged to us that adaptation occurs in various ways. One way is through technology change, and this is something USAID is very keen and aware of. They invest in technology development and new seed varieties, et cetera, et cetera. So there is technology, and technology, when it changes per force, requires a change in organization and how people organize themselves. If you introduce cotton as a new crop, a cash crop, you have then to create a cotton cooperative or some way of marketing this cotton. So there is a tie between technology and organizational alternatives that are meant to enhance adaptation, that are to improve the possibility of people surviving the kinds of pressures that they experience. The other element, which is was replete in the resilience literature, is that diversification is an important component of adaptation. So people being able to diversify their crops and to diversify their income, this enhances their ability to deal with any kind of pressure. And then the other element of our adaptation, which we perceive from our interviews, is the importance of social capital. I want to thank Doug Baker for this slide. It was his ingenious graphic contribution here. But the important point is we want to make here is that governance has an impact on the ability to have technology change, to have the adoption of new technology. Governance has an impact and can promote new forms of organization. Governance can support diversification, can support and enable more forms and broader forms of social capital. So Here then are just some of the current forms of adaptation. Contour plowing with tractors, these live fences, these are water harvesting forms of planting that capture water. You have people in organizations creating these women's savings group, which are a major source of credit for local villages and local communities. And then you have the organization where people agree to preserve a woodland and to fence off and to create measures of conservation. You have great diversification between crops and livestock. Most farms have some livestock. Some ethnic groups have large amounts of livestock. There is unfortunately a major emphasis on charcoal production and firewood sales to the Bamako market. There is the widespread use of native foods. These nere is, I don't remember what that word is in English. It's a word you hear every day. Nere is processed into a kind of jelly jam, which is then sold in markets, so it has an income. And then where it is possible, people are able to fish in the river or in these large standing water bodies, semi-permanent water bodies. Crop diversification, cash crop, I already mentioned that. Cotton is a big product, is a big crop. Sesame is an important crop, it's a cash crop, but basically the most important activity seems to be this women's gardening, which provides an important source of revenue for the household. And then there's social capital as adaptation, like I say, food sharing, labor sharing, etc. So then the question is, how does governance actually enhance adaptation? How does it do it? And we say, well, it facilitates this introduction of climate-smart technologies. It disseminates information across.
I have a question. I'm sorry to interrupt, but going back a little bit, what is the family? Is it like clans, or how you're talking about the communes and stuff? How big is the clan and family unit? Help me get my head wrapped around the governance side of things.
The family size, average family size from our data set, the range, let's say, goes from 6 to 15 people in a household. 60% of the households we interview were polygamous. There's more than one wife. And the ethnic groups themselves, this is a good question, ethnic groups are divided into something that my brother can say more about, divided into stratified, that are organized according to importance, as it were. Essentially a caste structure. There are castes. So there are different groups of people that belong to castes. And there is an issue of exclusion that we would like to have learned more about, but weren't able to do it. Get through this more. So once again, governance is meant to be to facilitate the adoption of new technology, to be able to create a structure where information can be shared not only vertically, that is between the commune and larger scale entities, but also horizontally across villages. And then adaptation, the governance enforces natural resource regulation, creates conservation programs, and then mediates the inter-village problem-solving process. And I think this is critical and many times overlooked. So what is the governance challenge? This very clever design, the very clever graph here shows that the impacts of climate change as you move from national, commune, village, household, the way that the sensitivity to these impacts become greater as you move to lower units, lower social units. That is, a household feels climate change impacts more than, let's say, the mayor does, right? But it is, at the same time, this is where the control over adaptive resources, particularly investment resources, goes in the opposite direction. It decreases as you move to the lower levels, so that households who are feeling the greatest impact of climate change do not have the access to the resources in which to adjust to it. And so what you would think of as effective governance is some way that would bridge, that would lower that gap, that would close that gap, as it were. And then we have, how does it do it? I mean, how does governance actually work? Well, there is this flow of resources that comes into the commune, that's on the right-hand side. There's a sharing of information that occurs as communes get access to information about new technology and markets and migration opportunities and employment opportunities and so forth. And also the government, the higher level external agencies also get information from the commune level. And then there is this horizontal effect, this participation and collective action where people are actually able to move among different villages in a given commune and to engage in kinds of problem-solving, discussion, dialogue, action. And so it has this horizontal effect, and then it has this vertical impact. And so an effective governance system is one which effectively enhances these vertical linkages from external resources, which digests the information it's getting, and at the same time mediates across these villages, providing more information to all villages and so forth, in bringing people effectively into the decision-making process. But governance in Mali, now we got problems, because governance in Mali is problematic. First of all, development planning has become a politicized process, where you might say, now this obviously doesn't happen elsewhere in the world, but it is where the consolidation of power takes priority over the well-being of your constituents, so that you have mayors and elected officials who are more concerned with maintaining their positions of power than they are with meeting the needs of their constituencies as defined in the PDSEC process. There is little effective participation. By that I mean, if I were to ask you, what do you know about the PDSEC of your commune? The vast majority of people would say, I don't know anything about it. I don't know what it is. I don't know what's in it. So here you have a development roadmap, a document, which is supposed to drive the process and the direction of development, and the vast majority of people didn't participate in its elaboration. We're not there, I guess, on the day that the team came in to do its little workshop, and they don't even know what it's in because it's not made available. It's not an available, organic, working kind of document. So there is another problem, is that there's very little technical capacity locally to actually do development planning, to decide what has to be done here. Many of the council members are actually illiterate. They don't read or write. So that the technical capacity is missing and lacking in a major way at the commune level. You're not elected to the office on the basis that you know how to read and write or that you have some technical expertise. The other thing is that the system of taxation is highly weak, is highly flawed at the local level. Taxes are supposed to come through market taxes, through head taxes, through the use of natural resource taxes. They're seldom collected, and they're woefully under the amount needed to fund any kind of a PDSEC plan. So there is then a general lack of financial resources to fund the plan. And there is a very little sense, this is important, of what I would call midterm, long-term thinking, a perspective, where you think today, what do we want our commune to look like 5 years from now? And then to go through that process and thinking in a monitoring and evaluation way to say, well, what was our last program plan? Let's look at our last plan. What did we achieve? What were the lessons learned? How can we take what the last plan was, the information from that, and build it into a subsequent document? That does not seem to happen from what our data would suggest. So what are the conclusions? What are the, presumptively here, the take-homes? Well, the level of effective governance in Mali varies. It varies. And if you look at the PDSECs, we reviewed the PDSECs from each of the communes that were in our sample. One or two of them are fairly sophisticated documents. They show that there has been a lot of thought. There's a lot of information. They show that it is attempted to become more inclusive. And then in the others, they're simply documents that have been put together pro forma, perfunctorily. They've been put together by someone outside the commune, hired as a consultant. And it looks on some of these, that is, if you took and did search and replace on one commune and put in the name of another, it would be the same document, right? It's all, there doesn't seem to be any thinking, any vision inside it. Now, on the other hand, effective governance, when you have a good leadership, and the leadership makes that commune more visible on the national basis. It makes it more visible, and it confers an advantage in that way. By doing this vertical linkage and doing these horizontal links, it makes it better. Then there is, the other conclusion is that there really is little understanding of climate change and climate change adaptation in the areas, the villages, the communes that we were in. And that people have only, they hear the word climate change, they don't have much of a notion about what climate change is and what the adaptation would be, what it would look like. And so the other fact is that where the communes are in better shape, such as in Kona, in Minijian, in those two communes we saw a much more active sort of PDSEC, more sophisticated one. We saw a lot more projects, the presence of a lot more external actors, and there you seem to have this external support, which allows and actually goes in and rewrites the PDSEC to make it look as if to add a adaptation component to it. So there's a direct relationship between the presence of outside actors, donors, that is, GIZ and aid itself, USAID, the presence of the donor and the content of the PDSEC with regards to adaptation to climate change. And what we argue here, I mean, you could say what comes first, the chicken or the egg, but what we've argued here is that this governance and this ability to have more vertical linkage and to activate these vertical linkages is what attracts these people to come in, attracts donors to come in there. So our recommendations, these were synthesized from the report and from the public consultation. The recommendations are simply that there has to be increased public awareness of climate change and climate change adaptation. And we would suggest, and we do suggest in the report, that this would be done through a series of capacity building workshops with the participants being the conseil, the council, the mayor, and other leaders within the community. The other is to formalize adaptation as a component of the PDSEC preparation. Doing that would mean that the government would have to revise its guidelines to say, we are going to do adaptation as part, you have to do adaptation as part of how you go through the process of developing it. Now they can go ahead and do that as they do with participation, and it all ends up as sort of a lifeless document. So what we suggest here is to providing the tools and mechanisms for integrating adaptation into development planning, and that would be through basic technical support, I think. And then Our other recommendation is to improve the monitoring and evaluation of PDSEC plans and projects. This was something that was hammered on in the public consultation. Our Malian colleagues were very keen on this. And then we have suggested that there be improved coordination among donors to decide where is donor money going to work towards adaptation at the commune level. Right now, GIZ does that set of communes over there. USAID is up in Mopti, but there's no coordination. There's no reason why GIZ is there and USAID is there, and there's no strategy of coordination. And what we're arguing is that there should be a coordinated strategy of dealing with adaptation and supporting this kind of development planning at the commune level. And finally, we've got to come up with money. There has to be some strategy for funding adaptation activities at the local level. We suggest in the report that this be done on a pilot basis, select some communes. And in fact, the Commonix project, I think, is actually doing that. And to provide provide resources where where communes are going to actually be able to engage in adaptation investment and so forth. So I think that's about all of it, yeah. And I would open it up to questions and discussion if you have any. And Mamadou Baro will handle all answers.
So if that's okay with everybody. It's okay with you, Tim. I'm telling you a little bit late. We'll find out. It's an extremely long web link that's mostly gobbledygook but unique, so you'll go to the right place. We'll find out what it is and share it. We'll send it out on so we're still figuring this out. This is only the second one that we filmed, and we keep doing it, we'll be more reliable and predictable about it.
You know, I've been teaching for 35 years now at the university, and usually I don't stop my discussion until 50 minutes and a bell rings. But I was able to control myself and discipline myself to make it only 45 minutes, right? No bell.
Just a note, this doesn't amplify. This is only for the webinar participants. So don't
Thanks for your presentation. I have two questions for you. One is a little bit about defining kind of the system of interest or the target for the adaptation, because there's trade-offs between the different levels. So you have, for an example, of adaptation, conservation of natural resource programs. But when you're dealing with smallholders, sometimes there's a negative trade-off for them. So I wanted to better understand kind of who you were seeing as the kind of adaptation targets or beneficiaries, or what was being adapted as you did this research. And the second one was to ask a little bit how you distinguished, for the purposes of analyzing the impact of good governance, between actual adaptation to climate change and then just sustainable development in general that was happening, without these climatic changes. And then, I know that doesn't make a very big difference at the local level to, the local actors, but just for purposes of your analysis,
No. Did you? Your first question is a very insightful one, really, and I hate insightful questions. It shows reflection on your part, and really there are all kinds of trade-offs. And what we were looking at was not so much the individuals that are involved in the adaptation process, but our own feeling is that adaptation actually occurs at the household level, right? Households make different decisions. They were deciding things this way. They were allocating their resources this way at one point, and now they're allocating their resources in another way. That being said, they're doing that as a response to stimuli from external systems that have changed incentives or changed opportunities. And so in the case of conservation and blocking off land, you're right. It can have a negative impact on households. Not only that, but if you were to look at what households are getting impacted, it most likely, I would predict, would be the households that are lower on the social status ladder. They're the ones, you know, like our environmental justice arguments and so forth. A matter of actual reality is that there is increasing conflict between herders and farmers. And so one of the things that the PDSEC is trying to do and argues for is for the creation of what they call livestock corridors. These are areas that are open just to the movement of livestock, and livestock would be restricted to those areas. Well, this has an impact on herders that's negative. So these kinds of trade-offs are going to happen all the time in adaptation, and adaptation strategies have to be somehow sensitive to that. The second question is more of, you know, from our impression is the way people lead their lives in these small farming villages, you know, and these fairly remote and underserviced areas, we find that the environment and the pressures that come from the environment, the nature of the rainfall, the available vegetation, the cutting down of trees for firewood, that all of these are actually the main factors that influence, that create the negative consequences for these families. And so I do look at adaptation as being a part of a broader development process. I mean, it really is about development. In adaptation, I think just as we think of resilience as a development, as part of a broader development, a key development narrative, we used to think of vulnerability that way. You know, it's become in this era, this era of climate change and changing environmental pressures, I think that most people are looking at development as some process, even in disaster risk reduction too, looking at ways of trying to adjust to environment as being a major part of the development agenda.
One point that actually came up from the research was very interesting. It's in terms of adaptation, the issue of powerlessness from the most, you know, vulnerable people sometimes, and also sometimes from the community. And we try to get more information on that. They were telling us, well, look, you know, it's not like, you know, these issues of drought are new. You know, people have been dealing with those issues for many times. But also you have the one big dimension is the state sometimes is on the way. And they give an example of somebody who would come, you know, who has connections with the prefect or the governor or, you know, someone in Bamako has a license to cut trees, you know, in an area. And then when they report, you know, that person, nothing happens. So these are also very important issues in terms, you know, of, you know, adaptation. And the issue of targeting also is very important because usually, you know, you can ask how these communities that actually benefited from these kind of tools to deal with adaptation, how were they picked up? Okay, but in many cases, it's just like it's not based on some kind of who are the most needed communities and what are the villages that need the help of. It's based on, well, we've been working here in this area because we had a Maya or DAP for like 10 years and it's more convenient. So there are a lot of interesting issues. We can't assume that the villages that actually are benefiting from these programs are really the way that I choose and that they are on the same equal weight. Because sometimes it's a matter of connection, as they told us, to the powers to be. The closer you are to the powers, the more goodies you're going to get. And that's also an important issue that we need to be thinking about, you know, in terms of this kind of climate change and adaptation issues.
Hi, thank you. My name is Russ Webster. My particular area of interest is food security and governance, so I really appreciate the presentation. It looks as though one of the fundamental problems that these communities are facing is that the PDSEC process itself doesn't work very well. And it perhaps in theory is a good approach as you described it. It seems like a good approach. But I would like to hear your thoughts about that and what needs to be done to get that process working more effectively, because by design it's an approach that has civil society engagement and so on and so forth. We still don't know a lot about who really ultimately controls the outcome of that. But I'd just like to hear your thoughts about who's addressing that problem and how is that going to become a better platform for climate adaptation. But I have a second part of that question too. I'm assuming that the PDSEC is not just about climate adaptation. It's about perhaps a range of issues that the community wants to get behind, or the local leaders want to get behind. And I'm just curious if in your research you observed any competition for limited resources among what issues were going to be of the highest priority, or was climate adaptation the only thing they talked about? But I'm assuming there were other issues that this forum for planning, other issues it addresses. So I'm just curious if there was any competition for prioritizing those.
I mean, this is a great question, actually. The term actually that people use sometimes, you know, just to emphasize, you're absolutely right. I mean, they call PDSEC, it's a nice concept with no real meat. Another way, I mean, it's a nice document. The way it's, you know, it really has, you know, it's like a long-range strategic plan for 5 years kind of thing, and it's supposed to have the participation of the people, and everybody should be involved, and all this. And we went through a meticulous way of, you know, looking at actually what happened to the different PDSECs. As my brother Tim said, sometimes it's almost like cut and paste kind of thing. You know, a consultant that actually did a PDSEC like 10 years ago, another one comes, picks up the same thing, and just replace the name. And so that's a major flaw. It really needs to be reviewed completely if we are going to be serious about sustainable development, social inclusion, and things like that. So that's really a major problem. But we did not also to, you know, the corner, for instance, where it was a little bit different, but that's really like an outlier compared to the vast majority of the cases. So that's also that needs to be emphasized. Now, yes, it's not only about the, you know, climate change adaptation. It's a development plan. But one thing I just want to emphasize, because we don't have a lot of time here, is the lack of systematic M&E kind of thing. I mean, there is some kind of evaluation, but it's kind of, well, money has been spent here and there, but what impact it had in terms of changing the living condition of people, that's not there. And there's almost zero participatory kind of M&E, where you actually, the same people, you know, come back and say, well, let's look at what happened last year. Can we adjust this and do this? And that is not there. So I think it's interesting in terms of how sometimes you get a great idea, and like a PDSEC, it's really like a revolutionary thing, you know. But then, you know, you look at the content of it and what's happening on the ground, and it's almost like an empty shell with nothing in it. So it's very important actually to think about ways to improve the process. But the problem also has to do with just, even if you, in many of these places, you have a situation where a caste system, where when you look at participation in meetings, for instance, the village chief would come, and you have associate who is a relative, another one who's, so at the end of the day, all the people who are in the structures are just part of the elite. So the elite capture is a major problem also, I think, that has to be. So how do you work with these kind of conditions? Perhaps maybe we need to be thinking about, well, let's look at successful PDSECs, I mean, successful communes that did something that actually worked and made a difference. And then since we have limited resources, you know, focus on them, so that other communes could look at, you know, at this as well, maybe we need to follow the same example. So some kind of positive deviance kind of strategy to look at what happens. So I think that's, but those are very important issues that need to be looked at. Yes, we're going to have a woman.
Yeah, good timing. I think my question follows on that. I'm Rebecca Carter. I'm with the Climate Resilience Practice of the World Resources Institute. And I'm wondering if you came across in your research any examples of maybe donor-supported peer-to-peer learning, you know, that kind of thing, because obviously that external support is indeed important, but donors can't be everywhere. And so, you know, I mean, social capital was mentioned and social relationships, and I'm just wondering, does it seem like that's been tried, and do you think that might be effective?
Specifically, something that you would call peer-to-peer, no. But in reality, one of the things that we have recommended in a more detailed elaboration of recommendations was that this increasing climate change adaptation awareness, that instead of having someone come in from outside and give a workshop or something like that, that they would work with the women's savings groups, which have this ancillary function of expanding information networks. They're really quite good sources of things that are happening, news, credit programs, whatever. And so to try to take advantage of that so that the kind of awareness that we think is necessary would be done in an actual peer-to-peer framework. But we didn't see any actual programs that were focused on that. I did want to say one thing to respond to this insightful comment here. And that is that the payday sec by statute, by regulation, deals in a specific number of sectors. It's in education and in health. So it's investments in health and health clinics and measles vaccines and things like that. And then in agriculture and livestock and in forestry and in natural resource management, sort of regulation, so to speak. So those are the areas they work in. But you're right that I think you don't hear people talk about the education and health side of this as much as they do about the problems with environmental pressure. Now, that might be the way we directed our questions too, and it might not have been methodologically appropriate. But I'm sure that there are priorities, especially if there is a single revenue base. So the revenues that come from this are supposed to come from, well, locally produced, but also from a government agency which has a fund that allocates the funding to these payday secs. They don't cover anything close to the totality, and it's only a fraction. But they tend to invest, I think, more regularly in the health and education sector than they do in the adaptation sector. So, here.
Been raising their hand long.
John Lewis, Terra Global Capital. But I've had previous incarnations, one of which was as an anthropologist. I did 4 years of field work in rural Mali. And basically, wasn't that in Mauritania? Where was that meeting? Oh yeah, well, I've been there too. I've been around. Anyway, and then, you know, we wrote our reports and concluded, and then I sold out and joined AID. But our conclusion was that without real land tenure security, there wasn't really any leverage back. And my neighbor here, Bob Winterbottom, has done some very successful things in Niger, Burkina, and Senegal, and to a much, much lesser extent, correct me if I'm wrong, in Mali, because in a later incarnation, I was the USAID representative at the OECD Club de Sahel, and we leveraged these governments to change at least some of their forest codes, where you actually would not get arrested for coppicing a tree, but the minister's friend or nephew or the préfet's associate could come in and cut and kill the tree and not get arrested. And that changed in those 3 countries. It changed to a much lesser extent in Mali. And you can see it in the aerial photographs. You can see the effect of that. So, you know, and then the donors, the club sort of fell apart. AID pulled out its position there, and there wasn't this kind of muscle coming into the government and say the party is over. You can't use land as a patronage system. And that was 40 years ago. And we did use donor-coordinated leverage back in the 90s and got these changes in these 3 other countries that I mentioned. And to some extent, I guess, even in Mauritania, and not in Mali. Okay, Mali's had some problems since then, but what happened to land tenure in this question? Now I work in climate change and the boundaries between adaptation and mitigation, and it's all about land tenure security. And if someone wants to buy a credit, the first question they ask, even if they're from a big, bad, polluting company like an airline, the first question they ask is, who owns the land? And if it's not owned in some sort of formal way, not just by the community, but by the women in the community, they don't buy the credit. Simple as that. So I guess I'm feeling like I felt when I joined AID, that people talk a lot about the easy stuff, training, education, technical assistance. That doesn't break any rice bowls in the hierarchy. And what happened to land tenure? So my question is, what happened to land tenure reform of some kind or another? You mentioned livestock. In many areas that we studied out of ILCA, the livestock were, most of the livestock were owned by farmers, by villagers. And what they liked particularly about the livestock was that they were out of sight. So if someone came to tax them, they weren't there. They were with the PUD, transhuming or something. And that was what they liked. So the stocking routes are very much in their interests of those villages. And they also, having the cattle on their farms after the harvest is also in their interests. So it's complicated, but it's power. It's about power. And land, development is about turning land into capital. And I just say, revisiting this, sort of time capsule, I don't hear the hard stuff being dealt with, and you can't deal with it without donor coordination. And that's more a reflection of the aid scope of work, more than what you've done, but you at least enabled us to ask a question.
Actually, this is something that my brother here should answer, because this is his area of basic concern.
Actually, I've been fighting with Tim and others about the importance of this particular issue. I think it's a really an underlooked problem, and I think the reason it's underlooked has perhaps to do with sometimes attitude to deal with easy issues. I agree 100%, and I still will make a lot of change. Yes, I mean, even the suggestion that were made to make people more resilient, be able to adapt more, you have to do the issue of land. I mean, we know clearly, and women told us many times in many places, and I'm actually from Mauritania, I'm also Fulani, so that we do these irrigated perimeters, maraîchage, and all these things. They don't own land. I mean, the issue, you have to resolve this issue. I'm working on land reform for Mauritania right now with the World Bank. But we're not making progress. Okay, and the reason, and I think really what needs to happen at some level is pressure. Really to be able to say, well, sometimes entities say, well, this is an issue that has to be resolved. I mean, we don't want to interfere with this and that. But we interfere in all areas, but when it's come to actually interfering in places where we know we're going to make a big difference, then we kind of stand back. So I think, that has to change if we really are serious into making this nice full concept of resilience, participatory development, social inclusion. We have to, and I think it's one of the single most important issues that has to be resolved. We want to move forward in terms of, doing things, that actually going to make a big difference. I think that's a very good, I agree with you. And one of the findings of this interesting work from Communities, USAID is that. If you read the report, you will see that we're trying to say, well, we need to be putting more light in this issue of land. If we don't, then we're not going to be, it's going to be just a nice talk and come back 10 years from now and talk about the same thing.
We didn't design the research adequately to deal with that, John. If we were to do it again, knowing what we know now, that would have been a much greater focus, I think.
I don't think they'll change. The power system won't change unless the donors say, get all the money, you get none of the money. Fix it.
Yeah.
That's what happened in Niger.
Yeah.
So,
We need strong conditionalities, actually.
Actually, we're going to take a
Are tribal structures meshed with formal governance structures. So is the mayor also the chief? Again.
To what extent are they in sync versus in conflict?
yeah. The first question was the donor coordination. I would say right now that from our talking to the mission and talking to GIZ and dealing with the NGO network in Mali, that with regards to climate change, there's very little integration, very little coordination in creating an actual strategy for addressing adaptation. And part of that is due to the fact that the government agency responsible for adaptation is exceedingly weak and has put all kinds of barriers in front of the donors in trying to create such a strategy. But our report tries to argue for the need of donors coordinating together and to look at Mali and look at a region of Mali and say, well, how are we going to address the adaptation needs, knowing that we have to improve the level of governance at the commune level, and that there is a vast need for technical support, there's a vast need for financial support, and there's a deep constraint in terms of getting a more participatory dynamic created. So these are areas that I think where the coordination would be better off.
But there is some semi-formal coordination in the GIZ, for example, attended the public presentation and discussion.
Swedes, and we're at the, so that there is what the public workshop suggested to us is that the narrative and the perceived need for greater adaptation strategy is widespread across the stakeholders that come from different areas of government, different areas of private sector, civil society, and donors. But the other answer, though, was to the question of tribal.
Yeah, I can respond to that.
Okay.
Yeah. I think if the tribal society and the traditional system and the central powers, it's the same mafia, basically, in my view. So I think there is more reliance on the tribal elites than actually looking at what's happening on the ground. I'll just give an example. For instance, because to get people to vote for you, you need, to get votes. Basically, you have to. The reality is, the vast majority of the villagers are kind of. They listen to the traditional leaders. They still are very powerful. So if you want their votes, then all you need to do is just, I'm gonna talk to Tim. I give him some money, resources, and stuff like that, and I'm guaranteed that his village or people around his ethnic group will be voting for me. So that's the kind of, so it's more reliance on that kind of system than anything. So which means also, really, if you want, when we develop projects, in terms of climate adaptation, climate change and things like that, there is also a need, there is a need for a review, of a good analysis of who are the stakeholders in place, and how we can, especially if we think in terms of theory of change, if we want to promote the kind of change we are thinking about. Of course, we cannot change this kind of situation that took many years and in some cases centuries to develop overnight. But how can we work with those kind of constraints to get some voices to get up? An example, right now in Mali, there are women, close to at least 700,000 women organized in saving groups. And they do wonderful work. I mean, they've been very resilient, and in terms of many other things. I mean, if you know, and they usually, I mean, some of the dissemination programs that we talk about could be developed at their level, and probably there'll be more success in doing that. And that's, at least from the participatory, from the meeting we had, you know, with the Malians, they say, well, this, if you guys want to do something, why not use them as a mechanism to get these wonderful messages, you know, because they are on the ground. I mean, they make a big difference. But the problem is they don't have the power. Okay? And we cannot also just come as developers and say, well, we're going to be just working. So we have to go through the government, all these kind of things. So there are some kind of serious structural constraints that we need to be dealing with. And if you look also at the money flow, the money flows in terms of RFPs, proposals that comes up. The agendas are usually driven by other things too. So if you want some organization on the ground to collaborate, I mean, and then they have different kind of systems that they rely on, it's making it very hard. So basically, we need to really think, we need to rethink about how we've been doing business, you know, and review these different cases in order to be able to bring about the kind of change we all, you know, are talking about and trying to get, you know, to get them actually happening on the ground.
Detail to that, and that is that there's another conflict in this governance structure, and that is prior to the decentralization initiative, the kinds of support that was provided at a local level went through career bureaucrats, public officials, right? And they're the préfet, the sous-préfet, and people like this. Now their power has been transferred over to these locally elected bodies, and they're unsure of what their job description is. And their job description is that they're supposed to have a sort of legal oversight over this entire process of development planning. But these are the people that provide extension services for agriculture, livestock, forestry. These are the people who are the main technical, the source of technical knowledge in the commune are vested in their hands. And you ask them, shockingly, you ask them, do you know the PDSEC? Did you contribute to it? They did not contribute to the elaboration of the development plan. These are the people who have their own plans of action, annual activity plans, to deal with the exact same issues which are supposed to be in the PDSEC, but they don't do it, and they're very annoyed. There's a real sense of tension between those people who are the official government administrators and those people who are the elected bodies. And I don't know where that's going to go, but it was clear that that was headed in a bad direction.
I'm Mark Carr with a CO2 Coalition, and I do a few other things too, but I think this is pretty closely related. When you go back and talk about deforestation, you talked about slash and burn agriculture, but then they're using the wood for charcoal and firewood, yeah, fuel, right? So is there what we consider a conventional like fossil fuel market or fossil fuels available as an alternative to that, which would then change the pressure on deforestation, allow the forest to grow back with a moderating influence on climate, weather, and potentially eventually climate, but also on water retention, water security. I mean, those things all kind of mix together. Back to his point about, you know, it's the land, and are the elites controlling the land, as you said about cutting and not going to jail. I mean, those are all kind of connected into fuel sources and what the women can buy with the cash they've developed.
Well, we saw no evidence that people are using alternative sources for cooking. Not even evidence of efficient cook stoves, right? But there, you know, I would expect to see little butane things and those kinds we see in the rest of the world, but I didn't see any of that or hear
you have to, right? And then you would imagine, and solar energy, for instance, would have been used in, there's plenty of sun, there, but it's not. But also there is a huge business around the charcoal industry, if you look at it in West Africa, and usually those who own those businesses are not part of they are not in the region. I mean, they are, they have no connection with the thing, but yet they are the ones who have the licenses to cut. So that's also a governance issue. So basically, I mean, I would just emphasize the importance of governance in general, in terms of land governance, in terms of just decision making, support systems for the communities to be able to be involved. It's not, that's one area, more than, I mean, the people know, and they are right now in Mali. You find people have the expertise, do many things, but the problem has to do a lot with the governance and also power, and it's still be concentrated in the hands of few people, and many of those guys don't have. I mean, the interest of the people is not really on top of their list of priorities, and and I think somehow we have to deal with this issue of policy.
So we've got some exclusion issues over here on this side of the room.
Hello, my name is Melissa Lloyd, and I spent last year running around Mali with a social enterprise working on agriculture, which I was very grateful for, because today when you mentioned social capital, I think Mali was a masterclass in social capital and what it can move forward and what it can hinder. My question is around the notion of adaptation for climate change and the notion of systems change towards the issues. So I think that at the village level, there's always going to be a propensity to address the thing that is happening to you at that moment. And then, of course, the governance issues that you're speaking of seems to be better prepared for this kind of deeper systems change. If we take all of these tensions into account and we come back to the funders, and we're the person magically writing all the money out for the next RFP, I'd like to hear your suggestions over the next, 3 things that maybe we're not putting enough money towards or enough thought towards at the moment that could actually make a change, both at that village level where people are able to have some autonomy and make those decisions, and then at some of those kind of mid-commune and region levels.
That's too hard for me.
It is a tough question, but it's a very good one. Well, what kind of issues to focus on, for instance, just going back to reviewing the notes, all those pages of notes, and sleeping in the villages and listening, remembering what they told me in the field. In some areas that were not very secure, actually, but we did that. We did go there, and just because we wanted to get a feel of what's happening on the ground. It's amazing when you are just about less than 90 kilometers from Bamako. You're in a place where basically people who don't even, kids of 7 years, 8 years, 9 years old, don't even have a school to go to. When they have to walk for like 5 miles, go to the nearest school and then come back, it's just, it's like, well, this is very strange. In Bamako, in a nice one, and then 2 hours later, it's like another whole world. What's happened here? And then the country has been independent since 1960. What's wrong? Well, I think if we look, I think first of all, my recommendation would be, let's really think hard first about where, especially in an environment where resources are limited, where should we focus on? Now, if I try to put their voices on this paper and just looking at their priorities, they would say, water. Why can't we get all these organizations with all this money flowing around and just to resolve this, because they say, okay, well, when we talk about vision, for instance, they say, well, actually, if we were just able to have, the land is very fertile, there are ways to put some kind of dams here and there, and then we can get water on 12-month basis. Why can't we do that in the PEDESEC, for instance? And so you run into, so I would say one area would be just thinking, how can we collectively, all of us, the Germans, the Americans, the French, work in one thing, let's solve this issue. The other important issue that was brought up to us was just governance, okay? When you have proof that the leaders are not, working for the interest of the people, and money being stolen and corruption, basically. It's a major problem. It's at different kind of levels. So, but the issue, how do we deal with this kind of issue? I think that's a very important thing. Now, the third issue, just I would insist on participatory monitoring and evaluation. Really changing the way we do. I mean, of course, every single project has an M&E component, but it's not participatory. 90% of the cases, it's not. At least in West Africa, and I've been in all of the countries in West Africa. So if we manage to get the communities themselves, the women, to have a say on how would you actually judge this project 2 years after it started, 3 years after it started. And when the managers also know that they have some kind of input in that, and that input is going to be taken into consideration, they're going to be very careful in terms of making sure that there is some kind of impact, because the impact elements are missing. Impact in terms of changing living conditions and things like that. I think when we talk to women, especially in this maraîchage, they say, well, really, if we have water, we can produce enough for ourselves, we could sell in the market. And now, we also have to take accountable the elites. I mean, there are some things that are like building basic physical and social infrastructure. That's the responsibility of the government. When they fail to do that, they should be accountable. And I really believe sometimes we need to put conditionalities. I mean, if we're going to give you this money, you have to do X, Y, and Z. That's one way to get them, moving into it. And I think the issue of land, unless it's done by those kind of recommendations, it's not going to happen. Because see, what's happening is they don't, most of the time, they tend to be more, to listen more to sending outsiders than to their own people. It's unfortunate, but that's the case for many governments. So, because they know that if the money doesn't flow, then they could be also in trouble. So, I think the first thing is reflecting on these issues, and then focusing at least on these elements that actually just came from the field. People focusing on governance, participation, water issues for the Sahel, because it's a major issue. And I think if we don't solve that, we have to prioritize and see if we don't get that good governance, the rest, is not going to have some positive impacts. And someone who didn't. Yeah.
I don't think so. My name is Munene. I'm from the University of Maryland, College Park. University of Maryland. My question is, you stated that we have some donors and external actors that are working in this area of climate adaptation. What do you think is the role that they're going to play in the long term? Because once maybe they are done with 1 or 2 projects, then they leave. What happens to these projects or these programs that are instituted in these communes and in the country?
Question. Actually, among many great questions, it's about an exit strategy, right? It's about transitioning ownership of the adaptation process into the hands of Malians, and Malians take responsibility. And what's the role of the donor community to support that, right? The Malian government has just shifted its focus on adaptation away from the Agency for Environment and Development. Isn't that what it is, Doug? The AEDD, and Sustainable Development. This is the group that has been problematic in dealing with donors. The government has shifted the sort of responsibility for some of the financing away from that group into its agency that's responsible for local, territorial, in other words, the governance agency. And what they have done is to authorize that agency to manage the Green Fund. And so Mali has been very proactive in trying to access adaptation monies globally. And what it's doing now is reorganizing itself so that those adaptation funds would go through their governance system and be presumably channeled into local level availability, rather than in the hands of a more national more national agency, you know, the more, I guess, the group that is responsible for environment and development. So this is a sign, I think, that Mali is thinking about assuming ownership of the adaptation process, and I think it's an appropriate time for the donor community to put together a strategy of support for that. But it all ends up being a support at a local level, right? Because it's local people, local institutions that are going to change. That's where the rubber hits the road.
You're not going to see any money if you're dealing with unelected territorial.
Exactly, yeah. Well, that's true.
So we've got about 2 or 3 more minutes. You've had your hand up for about half an hour.
I'm Terry Hill with the eMerge Alliance. We're interested in direct current microgrids. What's the availability, microgrids? What's the availability of electricity in this environment?
Virtually none.
Yeah, virtually none. I mean, that's what I think is amazing thing. You know, you just get out of Bamako and then even water, just people still drink from a river and stuff like that.
Sorry, I was a little boisterous just because I wanted to make one final comment. To me, the most insightful, one of the more insightful parts of your presentation was that incline-decline graph. Because it talked about control, it talked about impact, which is local, it talked about control, which is a lot of it coming from the center. And for me, the most critical governance issue that can make a change is around economics, and is around private sector driven incentives for people to start to have a level of income. It's very much related to what John was saying about land. If people in local communities are not working in an environment where they can transact for assets, then any sorts of planning or even implementation of planning that we try and do, at most is going to maybe affect some temporary behavior change. But for fundamental reforms to happen, even in the area of water, for example, to really make substantial changes in the improvement and the capture and management of water, it takes money and it takes investment. And if donors get together and invest, we've all been in this, well, not all of us, but we've been in this business long enough to see that donor-funded projects have they have a certain life to them, unless they are generating the economics, they are generating the incomes in the communities to create sustainable change. So to me, the real critical governance issue is strongly linked with the center. And the center needs to set the priorities for local governments to create an enabling environment so that farmers, entrepreneurs, men, women can start to do something to increase their income and really, frankly, afford to make climate change adaptations. And to me, that needs to be a really important dimension of the analysis. As to what degree, I was struck by your comment that a couple of communities had really good, thank you, and I suspect that they were probably better off communities. I mean, no,
they were, absolutely.
Okay. So,
absolutely.
So then that perhaps illustrates the importance of this point about asset control, transaction, enabling environments, so that people can really start to improve their economic life and therefore better participate in some of the changes that are needed as they go forward. So
that's a good concluding comment, I think. Thanks for that.
Thanks, everybody. Sorry to take you off, Bob and you. We have a few minutes that we can just chat informally. We're back on our third Thursday schedule on February 16th with the question of what happens to NOAA installations given a changing climate. Thanks to those of you on the web for tuning in. Thanks to all of you, and we hope to see you on February 16th. And mostly, thanks, Tim. Thanks, Mamadou.
Just before everyone goes, just one more thing. If you want to read the entire report that captures this study that the presentation was on, it's in final clearance with USAID now. We expect it to be available on Climate Links. That's climatelinks.org, certainly in the next week or so. So look out for it if you want to see the whole deal. Thanks again for coming.